Very good. I'm sure people will be walking in as we get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 10:45 session. I have learned a few things over my career. One of them is to never be late for a meeting with a university president or a governor. That includes former governors. So we need to get started on time here. We have one of each. My name's Ross Duvall, and I'm the Chief Research Officer at the Milken Institute. And we're going to discuss universities step up their role in regional economic development. I will submit to you that this is the most important panel for the long-term growth of the U.S. economy of any panel that you will attend today. So how do you replicate the Silicon Valley or North Carolina's Research Triangle? If the formula existed, it would have been patented and it would be alchemy. That's really the case. There's really no question about the foundation on which these innovation clusters reside. They're America's research universities. If I could have slide 1, please. It's a bit of a small screen, but let me explain it to you. This chart shows you what I call the regional innovation life cycle. It's the ecosystem of economic development, sustainability. The spatial clustering of innovative activity, especially in technology industries, is largely determining the economic success of nations. And these innovation clusters form and expand because new knowledge tends to be generated, conveyed, and collected more efficiently in close geographic proximity. So if you look at that chart, you'll see universities up there in that upper left-hand quadrant, but they are connected all the way across those areas. They are aggressively expanding their role in regional economic development, expanding paths for commercialization. They're spinning out new companies. They're involved in entrepreneurship. They're working with firms and industry clusters. And we are very fortunate to have a panel that represents all of those components of the regional innovation ecosystem. We have a university and a university's commercialization arm, as well as government and private equity, all embedded in the same person. And we have industry represented on the panel. What I'd like to do is show you that we don't just randomly select our panelists. If I could have slide 2, please. After I realized that we had representatives from Massachusetts, Maryland, and California on the panel with me, I've decided to look at our State Technology and Science Index. And we've been doing this since 2002, and it looks at research and development assets, so NIH funding. It looks at academic R&D, industry R&D, all the way through human capital and the ability to commercialize that research that takes place. And what you'll see is that Massachusetts has been number 1, and it's been number 1 every year since 2002. And Maryland is second, and it became number 2 in 2008. And California is third. And so that's all adjusted for the size of the economies. So we have a great panel today. Let me start to my immediate, all the way to the right. Ron Daniels is president of Johns Hopkins University, an esteemed university that my wife attended at one point. I have next to me Fred Farina, Chief Innovation and Corporate Partnership at Caltech. And I noticed the Corporate Partnership Officer was new, or at least it was new to me. And to my immediate left, Bahija Jalal, Executive Vice President of MedImmune and AstraZeneca. And last but not least, a man with a great first name, Deval Patrick, Managing Director of Bain Capital and former Governor of Massachusetts. What I'd like to do is kick this off with a question directed to each one of you. Fred, let me start with you. I think it'll set the scene for the broader discussion. You were responsible for commercializing the knowledge or research that's generated at Caltech. How do you work with companies, venture capitalists, faculty, and students to accomplish that objective? And how do you try and measure success?
Thank you, Ross. So our primary objective as a university is to push the boundaries of knowledge and for the greater good of society. And so our office sits at the interface between the academic world and the corporate world, the industry. And so that means that we need to be speaking different languages, the VC language, the research language, business and IP, all that. So we sit at the interface. So how do we measure success? I think so. A primary objective, in line with the university mission, is to get the research out into society for the benefit of society. That's our main objective. It's not primarily to make money. So that's clear. And so what is the success? The ultimate success is when actually a research result that was invented in the lab then makes its way to a product in society, and actually a new drug or a new device that improves quality of life. That's a very difficult thing to do. I think I'll show you a couple of slides to show that. And so I think in universities, the way I would say we measure our performance is how well do we facilitate the process from inside to outside university. Are we putting up a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to making deals with industry, or are we making that process as streamlined as possible and as easy as possible? So I would say this is where universities have a lot of work to do in ensuring that they facilitate the process from research to the commercial sector.
Thank you, Fred. Ron, if I could turn to you next. When you arrived at Johns Hopkins, you inherited a university that had enormous research capabilities. For example, first NIH funding for literally decades.
35 years.
Okay, well, that's decades. But not much in the way of commercialization success with that research. How have you attempted to address some of the cultural and institutional obstacles at your institution towards tech transfer and startup activity?
So Ross, as you indicated, Hopkins is a bit of a conundrum, but in truth, it's a conundrum that's shared amongst a number of other major American research universities, and indeed internationally as well. We know that a strong academic health center that has lots of research funding is an important linchpin of an economic cluster. We know that that's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition, because if for every institution like Hopkins, you were to be confident that that would be sufficient to get a cluster, then we'd have a lot of Silicon Valleys throughout the States and indeed internationally, but we don't. And that, in some sense, was the case at Hopkins. Hopkins, perhaps a more extreme representation of that, but 35 years, as I said a moment ago, year over year, the largest recipient of competitively funded NIH research funding, and yet if you looked at our licensing and patent revenue last year, it was about $18 million. Columbia was about $150 million. One could go on from there and look at the leading institutions to see the disparity. And so I think at core, when you ask the question, why is that so? I think a big part of the reason, as you indicated a moment ago, was culture. There was a real sense that Hopkins' role was, as captured in the tagline for our last capital campaign, provide knowledge for the world. The idea that the noble enterprise was to publish, but not to patent. And so what I think has changed on our part is, of course, it's about leadership and the commitment of leadership to see that there's nothing unseemly about this. Indeed, when we have gone out and talked to leadership throughout the university and talked to faculty who are in the receipt of these federal funds and trying to persuade them to contribute to this enterprise, we seldom talk about revenue. What we talk about is impact, and essentially argue that you have these ideas, but if you don't take control of them, ensure that they actually make their way into marketable therapeutics, goods, services, devices, and so forth, then we have faltered in our role and responsibility. And what's been really interesting is to see how, just by simply talking about this in these terms, it has unleashed a torrent of activity. In some sense, it was already there. The culture was there. It had to be, in some sense, given permission to go in this direction. And at the same time we've done that, we've done all the things that any other leading institution in this circumstance would do, but brought strong leadership into our tech transfer function, simplified the way in which we contract with outside investors, brought in entrepreneurs in residence. I mean, just all the things that one knows are cookie cutter. And then I think we've done some interesting things, as I hope Bahija will talk about, in terms of our collaboration with local industry.
Good. Thank you, Ron. Governor Patrick, allow me to turn to you. You had the good fortune of inheriting the densest area of brain power on the planet. You became governor, what, in 2007?
Yes.
2007, I thought that was right. Strong biotech, medical device, lively VC community, probably the strongest life science cluster on the planet, even at that point. But yet, you found some challenges, such as the ability of universities to collaborate together. So there was collaboration with industry, but not necessarily collaboration with each other. Could you share with us how you tried to address that?
Well, a couple things. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel. It's
Thank
great
you.
to be with the other panelists. I think I'm here mainly because of our life sciences initiative, which we launched in 2007 and 8, in part because we needed to address a global economic collapse, and we needed an engine of job creation. And our strategy, first of all, my philosophy is that we don't have to leave our economic future to chance, and indeed, I think in leadership at a time of economic emergency, you shouldn't leave it to chance. So we looked around and thought hard about what our inherent advantages were, and our strategy for growth was based on three things: education, innovation, and infrastructure. So within that framework, you consider the fact that we have 200 or 300 universities, teaching hospitals, research institutions within an hour and a half of downtown Boston. As you said, it's one of the most extraordinary concentrations of brain power on the planet. Some of those universities, I think in particular about MIT, very commercial. Some, as Ron was saying, including my own alma mater, thought of commercialization as sort of tawdry, not appropriate exactly. But everybody got the point that we needed a way to lift ourselves out of recession. And with the legislature's help, we put up a little money, $1 billion over 10 years, really not to substitute for the private sector, but ways in which we could plug gaps that the private sector had identified for us, that were roles that government could play with scientific advice, and the greatest power, I think, of political leadership is the convening power. People will come to the table when you invite them to, and we did, and we just kept doing that till people sort of got in the rhythm of collaborating. I'm very proud of the fact that by the time we left, we'd spent about $500 million of state money that had leveraged $1.8 billion of private investment and created thousands and thousands of jobs. In fact, it was one of the industries that pulled us out of recession ahead of most other states.
And at a time when we were in the midst of the Great Recession.
Right.
So it was remarkable. Bahija, you're kind of, to some extent, on the receiving end, but not necessarily receiving. Collaboration occurs as well. But when you look at trying to determine which universities to work with, how do you kind of monitor the value of those relationships? What are you looking for and how do you measure it?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be here. So I would say it is not just on the receiving end, like passive, and actually an active, because, I see myself in the industry that I am in as we are in the business of science. So, and science is about collaboration. And I think once you understand that you don't have all the talents. Not one single institution will have all the talents and everything. So you need to collaborate. You need to be open to the outside. So we look at for three things. One is first the science, the strength of the science. So if that's there is no negotiation there, and so that's what you look for in the institutions you're going to go to. The second one that's really important is the culture. Because it is beyond the good headlines and the signing and having names on the slides that you collaborate with this company or not. Once that's done, the real work starts, and you have to have scientists from both sides that believe that they can work together, and that 1 + 1 is more than 2. And they bring, actually, there is that respect that they have different perspective and they bring different views to the same problem. And the third one is obviously, how we measure the success and have actually deliverables, because I think how it was before is basically give me the money and I'll talk to you when I have something that doesn't really work, or companies coming and saying, I want you to do exactly what I want, which doesn't work either, right? So you have to have that very collaborative, but also some measurables. And the measurables don't have to be necessarily, I have these targets that I'm going to bring to the clinic. Even the understanding of pathophysiology of disease will bring us, further to understand, what we do.
Thank you, Vahija. I want to address this a little bit. Ron, in yesterday's luncheon session, you kind of touched on this, about the attention that's being placed on universities to commercialize university research in recent years, especially private universities. I mean, obviously the MITs, the Stanfords have been very at the leading edge in this process, but there's kind of been an increasing focus at private universities on this. What do you think has caused that?
So I think it goes back to the point that I referred to earlier, and that is that you want to have impact. And I think in truth, what we have found is that it's not just something that you see at the level of the stewardship of the university, but rather throughout the university, your young faculty. Even in fact, we have several senior faculty who are quite excited about this agenda. Your postdocs, even undergraduate students are coming with enthusiasm and brimming with ideas and wanting to participate in this kind of translational activity. So, I think that there is a pent-up demand for this, and in fact, by and large, what your responsibility is as a leader is to find outlets for this. But it's quite, I think, innate in this generation. And so your responsibility is to create the pathways, the institutional support, the policies, the personnel that make this easy.
Fred, what do you see at Caltech? I mean, I know there's been an increased focus on commercialization, but it seems to have accelerated even in recent years.
Yeah, I think was two factors. First of all, maybe three. In this knowledge economy, universities are poised to play a bigger role because they create knowledge, so that's embedded in that evolution. And then there's definitely a competitive element. To attract the best faculty and students, you have to have an environment that enables people to commercialize technologies, to have startups on the faculty side, this infrastructure support that activity, and on the student side, an environment also where they can learn a lot about entrepreneurship. It's a hot thing for students to think about. And so from a competitive standpoint, we've had at universities to offer more of these programs. And for us, and the president says it all the time, is to compete for the best faculty is very difficult these days. So, little perks here and there that tip the balance on the right side are important. So we're doing that. Often joke in our field that the young faculty now, they want tenure, spouse, children, a house, and a startup. That's kind of like what they're coming.
The question is, which order do they want them in?
That's up to them, but and so it's become a lot. Really, it's become part and parcel of the culture of universities.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, can I just add to that, because I'm not the university, but I think the one way to look at it is, universities cater to the population they attract, and we have to start thinking, it's engineers and doctors but also entrepreneurs, and maybe seeing what we're seeing is that the entrepreneurs don't have to drop out to go do something, but actually can start there in the university. And I think that's something really to try to see it a different way.
It is a different way.
I just
Yes.
build on this point. Michael Porter has done research about, I think he describes it as cluster theory around economic development. That people, particularly in innovation sectors, depend on and thrive on being in close contact with other people who are trying to solve similar kinds of problems, and they're bumping into them and so on. In a way, a university is already that. So the notion of expanding that sensibility from a university outside the walls or the gates is not that radical. And frankly, in Massachusetts, our strategy in each of the so-called gateway cities beyond Boston was how do we get the local educational and teaching institution to be the centerpiece of what it is we're trying to grow in terms of economic opportunity in that place.
Well, with this increased focus on commercializing university research, what can government do to aid that process, perhaps more as a catalyst? Deval, I'll let you go first, and then I'm sure others will have perspectives.
So in our case, the $1 billion of public money put up was not to do the science, although we did get a lot of feedback from the industry that one place where we could help catalyze was in the Valley of Death. Lots of great ideas that died before they were before their concept was fully proven out. We didn't think we were in a position as government to make those scientific judgments, but there were scientists in the community who were willing to take that judgment and do it with integrity and apart from the politics. So a small part of that $1 billion was dedicated there. But some of it was things like, infrastructure, sewage systems, and so forth that enabled a great company to nearly double the number of jobs and its production capacity, because that's what it would take, and the local community wasn't in a position to do it. Now we made judgments, about what essentially what the forecast was for job creation, what the clawback would be if it didn't happen, so that the public would be made whole. And we turned as much of that, as I said, over to the scientific community to help us make those decisions. But that's a sort of filling in holes rather than trying to, or gaps, rather than trying to substitute for private capital or the universities, and being a catalyst for both of them.
To this, I think that question is so important, and the governor, I think, has really emphasized importantly that, government has to be part of the compact here. So this idea that these clusters will arise spontaneously, independent of government support, I think is really fanciful. And one starts off, the most important role for government in nurturing these clusters is, of course, the very significant amount of federal research spending that has played a role in nurturing the kind of scientific capability that we see distributed throughout the country in our leading academic centers. So, without that, and critically, that is funding both basic and applied research, but without that, you really kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, because from that point on, it's really a question of how you exploit and take advantage of those things. So there's clearly a major role for the federal government in supporting the research enterprise, and this is where I can't miss an opportunity to point out that in the last decade, after the NIH budget doubled, we've actually seen a 20% contraction in real terms of that budget. That's a critical challenge for this enterprise that we're involved in here. So I think that's one very important role for government. But the things that the governor talked about at a state level, looking at where there are gaps, thinking about even things that, in the case of Baltimore, a city that obviously has its challenges as having suffered deindustrialization and the consequence of a lot of flight of manufacturing industry, it's been the state that's been a very important partner with us in redeveloping acreage within the core of the city to make it attractive for our faculty and staff to want to, and students to want to start startups in that setting, and to revive the local economy. So again, I think that's really thinking about this independent of government is remarkably naive, and I think ultimately self-defeating. And for me, what's really striking, and I say this as someone who grew up and spent a good part of my career in Canada, when you travel internationally, virtually any major city, any major region is grappling with these same issues. And what's, again, so interesting is to see the very innovative and forward-looking role that local governments, state and city, are playing in helping nurture the creation of these centers.
Anything else on government?
Well, two things I think that really struck me here that are really important is one is that leadership is bringing people to the table, which I think that you've done that is absolutely important because you have institutions, you have industry, and just bringing them as a neutral player I think is extremely important. The other vision is actually getting the local governments to understand that this economy or innovation economy is really important, and I have to applaud you for actually taking the risk, because this is what we equate innovation with is risk when the economy is not doing so well, but actually look at the payoffs, and I think this is something to really set the example for a lot of regions.
Can I add something
Please,
about
please.
what government can do? So, as was said very well, the local governments have to create the infrastructure around these clusters to help them nurture them. But if you go even before that, so the federal government funds a lot of fundamental research, billions of dollars of fundamental research. It strikes me how little is actually spent in taking these incredible ideas across the valley of death. And that we've been relying completely on venture capital and private industry. And they have gone more and more risk averse and later stage. So I think there's a sweet spot here that the government could play in helping, and universities over the years have developed this incredible expertise in commercialization, not just filing patent and licensing, but also, as you mentioned, EIR programs, incubators, and things that incubate this technology to position them for investment. Right. And I think if, say, NIH said, okay, for every grant I give, say $1 million grant to a research project, I will set aside 10, 20% as follow-on funding. If there is something that's interesting that could be commercialized, that would be very helpful.
Well, that's a very interesting idea. I've suggested the same thing. It hasn't happened yet, but we got to keep working on it. I want to change the discussion a little bit, because I know, Fred, you deal with this a lot, and I suspect Ron does as well. From a university's perspective, what's the process that you go through in trying to identify, I'll call them things that have the potential to be commercialized? Seems to me there's a lot of competition, if you will. What's the thought process? Maybe I could go to you first, Fred, because I know you deal with this.
Well, that's part of my job. So I think the first thing to realize that the technologies we deal with are very early stage. So we have to recognize that nobody can predict the ones that are going to be successful in the marketplace. That's fundamental. And so from that understanding, what we try to do is work very closely with the researchers, the scientists, the engineers who develop these ideas, and gauge how they're passionate about, how passionate they are about this technology, about their involvement in bringing it to market. Technologies that are just a piece of paper, a patent, without the participation, the active involvement of the inventors, typically don't go very far. So we spend a lot of time doing that. We try to cast a broad net in terms of patenting these technologies as much as possible. And then work with our teams, EIRs, venture capital, angels, to see how, do the market research necessary to understand how these inventions could fit in the business, create a company or license out. But it's a very hard process. I don't know if we're going to show the slides that
you
we
can
had.
just call it out. What slide? What
But it's, I think number 8. Is it 8?
it's probably
The funnel. Oh no.
it's that one. 13.
13.
13. Slide 13, please. There it is.
Just click through the entire slides just to show that this is the cumulative numbers over 91 to 2004, the amount of federal research that went into universities, U.S. universities as a whole. And so it went for $800 billion in research funding that generated 320,000 invention disclosures, and then 175 patents, patent applications, that resulted in 70,000 patents, and then at the end you have 37,000 active licenses and options, and 9,000 startups. So, and that's what comes out of universities. And then if you get to the next
Slide 14.
that's even, I think, probably more interesting, that how difficult this process is that when we feed these startups into the marketplace, then you see that roughly 1 in 100 pharma compounds actually get approved. Roughly 1 in 10 venture investments actually have significant hits. So it's a very difficult process that needs to be nurtured.
Is there a difference from commercializing from the science perspective as opposed to what I might call the softer side or the social side? And so from the science perspective, how do you see this process? When you're looking at universities and trying to either help them identify IP that might be of value or might be of specific value to you?
Yeah, I think we have just listening to your question before. I think you have to create that culture that actually the scientists start just valuing the intellectual property the same way as the publications or something, right? So, and that's true for academia. It's true for the company, because it's once you get, it's not all the obvious. Also, discoveries are going to be the ones, sometimes like discoveries in fruit fly is what's helping us today understand more or bring things into fighting cancer. So it's having that kind of culture a little bit where they see the same incentives of having patents. So I can tell you, if you walk into my company, we have a big wall to celebrate the patents, the scientists for the patents, and on the vis-a-vis, the wall vis-a-vis is the publications. So that's really, both of them are important. And I think that's why I said the power of collaborating. You know, when you are in a company, you know exactly what drug development pathway is about and things like that. And I do believe that when you bring, people from academia and people from the industry to look at the problem, they actually feed into each other. So that's how you can do it. I don't think there is a magic formula that says if you have this and you have that, this is going to be a successful, patent, or that's going to lead into something. But is actually working on the problem together, I believe, is really important.
I wanted to ask
I don't know if
Ron
I'm
this
answering
question.
your question, but
You're addressing it. I remember I had the discussion with the former head of Johns Hopkins and the discussion on should we look at patents as something material to receiving tenure, the way we do publications? I mean, what's the current thinking on that?
So it varies across the institution. The dean of the School of Engineering is very enthusiastic about bringing patents into the portfolio that faculty members can present for purposes of tenure. There are departments in the School of Medicine where there's a growing willingness to acknowledge this. So I think that at least at this point in time, I've very much taken the view as president of the university, this is something for the school leadership to work through, but I think it's a totally legitimate question, and I think there are a set of best practices out there that can actually ensure that you're being true to the traditional role of the academy, the kind of publications you want to see, at the same time seeing patenting as a very legitimate form of creative enterprise that should be recognized in the tenure process. So I think it's moving in the right direction. But again, if you ask me the question of all the things I think we need to do to be able to kickstart the innovative capability of Johns Hopkins, I would say that's a signal.
Yeah,
but there's so many other things that are more important. And the one thing, and then it goes back to your last question to Bahija, but the one thing that I worry a lot about, and again, I take it the purpose of today's discussion is to really think about how generalizable are the successes of Cambridge, of Silicon Valley, of San Diego and so forth in the biomedical area to other centers throughout the country. And here, one of the things that I worry a lot about is as Bahija knows, because we've talked about it a lot, is the lack of contiguity of the key assets. That is, industry is located in Montgomery County. That's where Bahia is. It's 45 minutes from us. We don't have at this point the kinds of complementary institutions that make for a vibrant cluster. So we've got assets, and on the on the chart that you showed at the start of the session, it looks like we're replete with assets, but it turns out that they're not contiguous to one another. And so again, when you ask the question of how do you do this? How do we find the ideas? It's so much easier when the conversations are constant and serendipitous, and the ideas can grow from that quite naturally in a way that we have to be more deliberate in making up for that deficit of contiguity. And that, to my mind, if we could overcome that, then again, by definition, we'd have a vibrant cluster. But if we could overcome that, you know that this would be so much easier to do the work that ultimately has a kind of impact that we're seeking here.
Can I?
Please jump in.
Sorry, just comment on two things. One is I always worry when we take it maybe to the extreme where we start thinking, we have to get the commercialization, as we call it, be linked to tenure and other things, because we have to remember that, and this is a plea maybe from me, being in a company, that we have to also celebrate blue sky research. It's very important, and that's what academia does best. And for me, just catering to both, because that blue sky research we need. And the companies are not going to do it because we're not set up that way. But we need also that part in the academia. So we need both. They can do both, like I said, and they can cater to the entrepreneurs and to the others. And the other cluster maybe around that's going to be different, it might not be the same as what you see in Silicon Valley or others, is looking into the future is that intersection of technologies. So the intersections of not just the biotech is the high tech, and now we see with the wearables and everything. So maybe that's going to be what we could do in Maryland.
What are we seeing at universities trying to support entrepreneurship in terms of students and faculty alike? I mean, these aren't skills that someone necessarily has learned prior to coming to college. What are some of the innovative programs that universities are undertaking?
So, for us, and again, this has very much been part of this process of trying to think about how we quickly bootstrap ourselves up to the point that we've sort of checked all the boxes in terms of adopting best practices across the field. But, things like offering an entrepreneurship minor to our students, it's now really interesting. Again, this is where we have to think about this from the supply side, but there's a really palpable demand out there that we just need to listen to and be responsive to. But in our case, we have about 5,000 undergrads. More than 30% of them are now taking entrepreneurship minors. I mean, that's a great thing. That is, they don't feel that they have to go to a full business degree as an undergraduate. They're still doing their majors in history or biomedical engineering, you name it, but they're adding entrepreneurship into that. I think that's a remarkable and easy way for us to accommodate this instinct to make the students market ready. There's a lot of impact you can have just by putting some seed money out for various competitions for business plans, innovative ideas. We're doing a lot of that. I would say the most interesting, perhaps impactful thing that we did, again, it's nothing that was new to Hopkins, it's just catching ourselves up to what others are doing, was offering a boot camp for faculty and graduate and postdocs, graduate students and postdocs, to be able to essentially over a period of the summer throw themselves into an entrepreneurship immersion program. And just the last thing, I'll turn over to Bahija, should talk about our joint PhD program, because I think that's actually something where maybe we are establishing a best practice.
Yeah, let's go to that. Why don't we?
Yeah, so I think we had the pleasure of really collaborating with the Johns Hopkins and with Ron and being a visionary and really progressive there, is to actually, for me, establish a PhD program that's definitely run by Johns Hopkins, where the PhD students have the possibility to come and work at MedMillion for 1 year if they choose so, right? So this program is new to the US, but we have been running it in the UK with the University of Cambridge for many years, and it's working really well. And I think for me is the idea of we need to just open doors for the students, that they have choices. Because if I look at myself, went through PhD and postdoc, and I call it the 28th grade, not knowing, not knowing that there are different paths. Actually, we look down on the companies as if you want to not do science, you don't go there. And it's completely had to go the other way to see that I was completely wrong, but I didn't know that. So I think it's just exposing the same thing as we do now we start even in high school, but I think here really starting this program, and since we started that with Johns Hopkins, we have other universities now interested. So hopefully that's gonna, again, just give outlets and give the choices to the students.
Fred, you have an entrepreneur in residence program, right? Maybe you could describe how that's working.
Sure. So let me go back a little bit on the. So we have a graduate focus. We do mostly research institution. We do have an undergraduate college, but we have more grad students than undergrads. And there's there's two sets of activities in entrepreneurship in university. One has to do with the education part, that has to do with undergrads and a lot of business ideas, apps, not necessarily based on research and technology has been developed over many years. So we don't do a lot of this because it's not so much the interest of our students at the undergrad level. We focus on the graduate levels. So the training they need is very different, because these are people who have worked on the technology for 10 years, and now they need to learn the tools to take this technology to market. And so some of the things that we put in place have been very effective. It has to do with funding and expertise put together, and infrastructure. There's those three things. So funding, we have an early stage called the Caltech Innovation Initiative that we award to faculty or grad students or postdocs with ideas that could be commercialized. They have to hit milestones, and that's been the most effective tool at positioning these early stage ideas for investment by outside companies. And then we've brought in a year ago this EIR, a bit different from typical EIRs. It's a full-time EIR for 1 to 2 years. Probably is going to go into 2 years. And working very closely directly with the faculty and guiding them through the process of what do you need to do to de-risk the technology and to create a business case that someone would be interested in. And that's been extremely, I think, effective.
Governor, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, I've heard this from other folks at universities that say that government has a role to play much earlier in the commercialization process from universities in terms of entrepreneurs. No, not just the science, but people with a new business method. What role can government play effectively there in trying to aid that process?
Well, first thing I want to say is just listening to the last few minutes of conversation is very, very encouraging, because while I am not one who believes that the central purpose necessarily of a university is to prepare employees or entrepreneurs, the bright lines we've had between the academy and industry and government, for that matter, to Ron's point earlier, are blurring. And that's a good thing. By the way, I would say it's unique in this country. Everywhere else you do, where we traveled and did business, those lines are blurred already, and there's a whole lot of involvement of the one sector in the other. So I think we've been hearing a lot of good news here. And I think the direct answer to your question, Ross, is it depends. It depends on the cluster. It depends on the need. I think it's very, very important for government to listen and take its cue from private industry and the university, and to know its place. Having said lines blur. There are certain things government can't do or do well. I think that there are that a big challenge in this space on the industry side, but also on the government side, is overcoming short-termism. Right? We have this in industry, this quarter by quarter focus. In government, we have this election cycle to election cycle focus, or news cycle to news cycle focus. And really, to create a cluster, you have to be thinking not about the next news cycle, but the next generation, and how you stay on course for a period of time in order to let these kinds of clusters flourish. So, in the case of the life sciences, again, just one example from our experience in Massachusetts, it was enormously important. It'd be a 10-year initiative, not for now, but a 10-year initiative, that we have some flexibility to adjust as the cluster evolved, and we wouldn't have to go back to the legislature for every adjustment as we went along. And in the early days, the issues were about, as I said earlier, helping to catalyze venture capital investment in the valleys of death, helping to place students, undergrads and graduate students, in summer or other internship opportunities in companies and startups, so they'd be exposed, and in laboratories in competing universities as well, which is a whole, as you would know, Ron and Fred, a mind-blowing undertaking, or mind-bending undertaking.
I'm sure in Cambridge it's even more mind-bending.
It's really something, and it wasn't limited to Cambridge, but that's a whole new way of thinking. And then I think we did a couple of things. I'm thinking of a high-speed computer project that we did in Western Massachusetts, which was a collaboration of a half a dozen research institutions, a half a dozen large companies from inside and outside of Massachusetts and state government. And many of the people around the table were saying, my God, I've never sat here with my colleague from another institution and worked on a project together. Not just put money in, but actually worked out how to make it sing. And that was an opportunity to practice the kind of collaboration, which has benefits, I think, all on its own, but also gives you insights about where government can plug in.
What do you think about this idea, real quick? I want to ask the governor this, that Fred suggested, and I'm going to twist it a little bit, but if we had government and private equity funding commingling together, so if you got a dollar of private sector investment, the government might put in $1.
Well, we did it in the
reverse,
kind of sort of like that, although we didn't take in state government an equity position more often than not. We did a low or no interest loan. It de-risked the deal for the VC, and we were taking our lead from the VCs who would have done, and the scientific community who will have done the diligence, because that was their expertise, not government.
Ron, do you want to jump in?
Well, just on that, I mean, I think it's really important that, just to the point the governor made, that as you think about these kinds of partnerships, that you are very attentive to the moral hazard problem, and you don't end up having essentially a lot of the unwarranted risk being sloughed off on the government, that goes into this naively. So I think the idea of some true risk sharing is important. I'd like to pick up on something the governor said, because I think there's a few things in what you've done that really are so remarkable and have set a standard for other regions in the country. One is doing this at a time when it wasn't so obvious that was the right place to invest, and you have a limited number of chits, but you put your chit down in this area, and that's significant. I would say, the second, and something that you said a moment ago, but just having government with some walking around money, being able to force collaborations for people or institutions that might be disinclined to do that is really powerful. Mm-hmm. And it's just a great way to overcome tribalism, is to have, in some sense, government there as the honest broker saying, here's the deal. We're going to do this. We're not doing this as a sub region of Cambridge, namely it's just MIT. It's going to be with these institutions, and we're even going to get you out of the Cambridge bubble. I mean, I think that's very powerful, because our places are so mission driven that if there's money on the table that is sensible, it will be picked up and embraced with gusto. And so I think that's powerful. But the third piece of it and this is what I'm interested in your thoughts on, we know that at some level, this is kind of an elite strategy in putting money into institutions, I will say, in your state, have very large endowments in contrast to my state and my institution. We're endowment challenged. Harvard is not. And so the specter of you as a political leader saying, I'm going to put more money into these institutions which are already kind of blessed, and you say, but this is for the good of the state, there's going to be job creation and so forth, but nevertheless, it has the scent of an elite strategy. And I'm interested, particularly in the parts of the state outside of Cambridge, how did you justify, as you did the precinct work, how did you justify this spend as opposed to, we'll put some more money in and see if we can bring manufacturing jobs back, we'll give money to, this brake manufacturer and we'll be able to secure 20 jobs. How did you manage that?
No, really, really important. May I?
Please.
Really important questions. I'd say at the beginning that a going in sort of condition precedent about participating in the innovation economy is raising your tolerance for failure. That's very hard to do in government. We talk all day long. Folks talk about how they want innovation in government. Make one mistake, and you get hammered, right? And everybody draws back, right? So part of this was about getting the point across that we were going to try some things, not all of which would work. Secondly, more directly to your question, Ron, we were trying to make judgments about where to use those government resources, where they were appropriate to use, and not where they were just candy for. I will tell you, Harvard, by the way, also says they're endowment challenged, but I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Seriously, with a straight face?
No, they do.
I know what you mean. But so, for example, I don't think we ever did a grant to Harvard. We did do, as I meant, the example I offered earlier, an investment in the town of Framingham in their underground infrastructure to enable Genzyme to justify moving manufacturing out of Cambridge and into a community where a whole lot of people needed. And we also invested in the skills gap training that was necessary to enable people to take advantage of those jobs. Because one fiction about the growth in the life sciences is that it's all about people with PhDs
Correct.
and white coats,
not.
right?
I
It's
agree.
not.
Right. No,
It's
that's
not. Very, very important. And by the way, that was an education opportunity or a challenge that we had with the general public. One of the fastest growing industries in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, when my grasp of this data was still current, is advanced manufacturing. And one of the points we were trying to make to these burgeoning companies in Kendall Square was that when you start to think about your, when you're ready to start making things, not just inventing things, but making things, don't just compare the cost of manufacture in Kendall Square to the cost of manufacture in Texas, but compare Kendall Square to Pittsfield or Springfield or New Bedford, some of these so-called gateway cities. And as we got them to do so and made that case, we started making things in other parts of the Commonwealth, and that really did reach the folks who most needed a way forward, meaning folks who had been so displaced by the recession, but were coming to grips with the fact that they were never going back to the job they had before the recession. They had to reinvent themselves, and so we didn't finish it all or solve it all, but directionally, as I say, I think that was right.
This is the challenge I know you face, Ron, in trying to turn around, not turn around, but involve the community in the economic benefits of the work that you're doing, and to make it more broadly inclusive. What's your philosophy as you approach that?
So at one level, of course, we're desperate for success. We need to be able to show that through this kind of activity, ultimately we have successful startups that ultimately bring jobs and tax revenue, and I think that'll be enormously important. But you can't, at the same time you're waiting for that, and we know that this is a game of probabilities, and so we're playing the game, but we have no idea if that's tomorrow or if it's 10 years from now. But we'll continue to play. But in the meantime, we're being very, indeed, almost dogmatic about the faith we have in this agenda, and using it as an opportunity to think about, one, how we can take the same sort of ethos of innovation into the social innovation sphere. So thinking a lot about the same kind of characteristics of disruption, of trying to take ideas into action and bring that into a host of social issues that we see within Baltimore, and incenting students and faculty to do that. I would say the other thing that we're doing, and this kind of joins to the conversation we were at yesterday, is trying to play a role in working on what is, I think, the great glass ceiling that confronts all of us in this agenda, and that is the abject failure of our K-12 system in this country. And so, here in Baltimore, we went through the PARC tests. I mean, the results are scathing in terms of low levels of proficiency. So again, we're trying to turn up our advocacy around reform of the public school system, but we're operating and we're adopting schools. We're bringing science programming into schools. So doing a lot of those things that you're not fixing the system, but we're hopeful that we're able to populate demonstration projects that will then fuel this reform. But again, to be in a setting where we're able to create the scope for this kind of innovation, and ultimately find that it bumps up against the hard reality of kids who are neither numerate nor literate, is going to be a huge. It's not just a challenge; it's a crisis.
Let's wrap it up. I have one last question for each of you. It's going to be the same question. You might answer it differently. If you could change one thing about, in order to encourage commercialization success out of universities, what would it be? Governor, what do you
Start
think?
down there so I can think about it.
Ron?
I think it is the willingness of public leadership to really tackle this issue in a serious and coherent way, and work through and develop a game plan that works back from not just sort of the tail end of how you actually incubate an ecosystem that makes sense for the innate advantages, the science that you have within region, but I think really works it back into the K-12 system. And maybe, again, we know this funding in early childhood education, and maybe it's back to almost the womb, but you need that. If we're in the human capital age, then you got to treat this as your core asset and cultivate that. And I think that's the imperative I'd love to see being met.
Brett?
I think I mentioned earlier, but the government needs to put more resources into getting halfway across the valley of death. And by giving funding, I think universities have developed the expertise now with their tech transfer, their entrepreneurship programs, entrepreneur residence, all that, incubators, to take those technologies. But what's missing is the funding to get those further down the path of commercialization. I think there's a great sweet spot there for the government to play.
Bahija, looking from where you sit, what would you say?
Yeah, no, I applaud of what's happening at the universities. I will be doing the second plea the same way, is that I think really seeing that the collaboration is what works best, but then preserve one part of the university for also the people who want to do blue sky science. I think we need that. I think that's the strength of this country, and I think it's extremely important.
And NIH funding.
Yes,
getting,
absolutely.
We're working on that. We've helped restore some NIH funding, but we're still working on it.
It's a big
Governor?
gap.
Well, I think many people have made it in different ways. This point about collaboration is enormously important. And in government, in industry, and in universities, we can encourage that and we can model that. And in government, I think it's important for us to listen to the lessons that come out of that and respond as and how we can.
I think with this great group of panelists, we probably should have an online learning program And they can do that if they go to our video, go on the web, and they can see this replayed because they'll learn an awful lot. We've got to end the session because everybody's got to get to lunch. I'm sure the panelists will be glad to answer a question maybe after we can, end the session. But I appreciate all their input, and it was really a pleasure to moderate this group. Thank you very
Great
much.
job.
Thank you.